Doug keeps on wanting to do my makeup.
I really want to.
And I told him that if I'm completely incapacitated.
Like in a coffin.
I'll let him.
That'll be good. All right.
Anyway.
I am coming. Yeah.
Okay. In the grave, you can do.
Thank you.
In the grave, unless I can still use these 3 fingers. But
I feel insulted by my ability.
You could do my hair.
Can I do your hair and makeup? And pick your wardrobe?
Yes.
I do pick your wardrobe.
You mean for my gravestone photo?
No, I kind of want to do it every day. So when we live together.
In a condo.
You
just do my makeup.
I'm going to do your makeup and hair every day.
I'll let you do it once and then I'll
That doesn't feel right.
I'll rate you 1 to 10.
This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and guests. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. This podcast also does not establish a standard of care, doctor-patient, or client relationship. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. And because each person is so unique, all listeners are encouraged to connect with counseling and medical professionals for assistance with their personal journey. All people, places, and scenarios mentioned in the podcast have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved.
Welcome to We're Not Fine. I'm Dr. Talia Jackson.
And I'm Doug Jensen. We thank you for listening every week to our deep and thought-provoking conversations about relationships.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of We're Not Fine. We have with us an amazing guest today, Sterlin Mosley. And one of the topics that we are always fascinated by, that our viewers have really loved, is to talk about narcissistic personality and narcissism. You know, and as you probably are well aware, given that you are an expert at this, which I'm going to let you tell a little bit more about that expertise in your background. But the truth is, this is a topic that everyone is talking about. I think especially since the election of 2016, not to point fingers, but we certainly had some very visible narcissistic behavior in front of us. So it's kind of been thrown out so much. So Sterlin, welcome to the We're Not Fine podcast. Please tell our viewers all about you.
Yeah. So I'm in Oklahoma, Norman, Oklahoma. I teach at the University of Oklahoma. And I was kind of all over the place academically. I studied English for my undergrad. And then in my master's degree, I got a little bit more focused, I guess, and started studying. I studied counseling and focused on personality and personality disorders. So I did that in my master's degree. And then, I love personality typologies. I love personality typologies. I started that in high school, specifically the Enneagram as one of my favorite personality typologies. And so then my PhD, I actually did my PhD in communication and also taught in women's and gender studies and taught queer theory and all kinds of things. So I've dabbed a little bit in this and that, but finished my PhD in communication and then kind of went back to my psychology graduate school roots and delved more into personality psychology and got really interested in, I've always been interested in empathy as just a concept and, kind of identify as a highly sensitive person, I guess. And so I've been around some narcissists in my life, in my family and also professionally. And so it just seemed like a good time to kind of converge my interests. And so I kind of combined my interest in the Enneagram personality typology and narcissism and came out with, did a research study and then wrote a book, The Narcissist in You and Everyone Else. And right now I teach human relations. So I teach classes on, of course, personality. And then I also teach cultural awareness and social justice classes like that. So lots of consciousness raising kind of stuff. So yeah.
This was probably, in all the questions that we're going to talk to you about, Sterlin, probably my favorite question, because I remember in graduate school a long, long time ago, we talked about personality disorders. We were in the Axis 2 section of DSM-4. And, we were talking so much and my professor was talking about is this organic? Is it environmental? And in these 28 years of practice that I've had since, I've just been monitoring that and thinking about it and try to process, what do I know about correlations between people's history and families of origin and modeling I've just been so excited to kind of understand it. So I'm dying to ask you that question and get your sense of things, not only from a personal and professional.
Yeah, what makes someone narcissistic? I mean, it's a big question. I tackle it a little bit in the book. I think that I look at it holistically. So I definitely think that there's biological factors. I think there's some brain stuff. We know some things about the circuitry that goes into forming empathy. Sometimes there's a deficit there for many people with narcissism. And there was a research study I remember reading about even trauma or stress in utero for some people. There was a slight correlation to that, and some people developing narcissism. Of course, it can develop a lot of different ways as well that aren't narcissism. So I think there's definitely a biological component to it for some people, and because I have also known people that I interviewed for the study that had narcissistic parents and a narcissistic grandparent, and they can kind of like see it throughout the family line. So maybe there's some sort of inherited DNA kind of genetic component to that. And then of course we can look, I think that the one that's easiest for, I think for us to study is environmental factors, right? So what was your childhood like, and what was, how developmentally what happened, and many people that I talked to that were aware that they were narcissistic, or even if they weren't, and I was aware that they were narcissistic, they often talk about sort of early experiences where there was a strong theme, and I'm going to talk about this in the next book a little bit more. I didn't have time in the first one, but there was a strong theme of like the moment where they kind of remembered shutting down vulnerability, like they were embarrassed or something happened, maybe they were punished or something happened, and it was usually something they interpreted as embarrassing or
like shameful or
shameful.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And they just sort of decided never again.
Wow.
Yeah. And so then it seemed from that, and it's pretty early. I mean, for most people, it would seem to be around the ages of between 7 and 10, right? And they were just like, nope, no more. So I think there's definitely an environmental, developmental part of it. And there's some interesting studies about privilege and class and narcissism, right? There's a higher incidence of it in people with a lot of privilege, whereas it seems to be less so with people that are in, impoverished communities, although other things can happen. So I don't know. I think it's a combination of all of these things. You kind of throw all those things in a bag and shake it up, and
you get a narcissist.
And out comes a narcissist out in the tube.
Congratulations.
It's like Willy Wonka. I am riveted by this part of the conversation. I've read so much over the course of my career as well about the origins of this, but you reference some pieces like that 7 to 10 age gap, the shameful or embarrassing circumstances that might lead somebody to shut down their vulnerability. I'm going to process that for a while after this podcast, because I'm really kind of fascinated with the development of how people cope with that and what they do with that, and that narcissistic personality traits can evolve from that is just a really interesting piece. Because some of the more well-known people in our culture who are clear narcissists, like I've read about their backgrounds and going to boarding school and being removed, and any sort of, and the privilege piece that you reference, I'm fascinated by. I think the correlations are really interesting.
That it wasn't safe to be vulnerable, to be themselves, to have any feelings other than being completely together or strong or in control.
But then that inability to empathize and that difficulty, regulating those give and take relationships. Talia, the thing too, I mean, think about the kind of manifestations or the implications of being privileged.
Yes.
Like the expectations that come from that.
Well, and that's exactly what I was thinking about. I was very curious about the results of those studies because I was thinking, could it go either way? And I do wonder if there's something environmental about like the people, what I'm picturing, people with more privilege, the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren are seeing the way they are in the world and the way they treat others or the way they talk about other people that maybe don't have as many resources.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's, there is a strong correlation between, people in more impoverished people tended to just demonstrate more compassion towards people that don't have as much, right? So it's like there was more, those empathy circuits were a little bit more developed, whereas generally, and I'd have to go back and I wish I was that person that could cite the study and the year. I'm not, sorry, but it's out there.
Page 25, part B.
Right, exactly.
We're so disappointed. I'm kidding.
Right, it's out there, but I did see that there was a correlation also between, people that had more privilege and just those empathy circuits not firing as quickly. Like it's like, well, I have mine, and not necessarily that they're trying to be hurtful, but there was just an unawareness of, what they didn't have, right? Or what other people didn't have. And so, yeah.
So I'm kind of curious too, like going back to this vulnerability, which again, I'm kind of focused on a little bit. I love it. The lack of like being able to tolerate that. So this need for validation, this need to be associated with powerful people, that need to be fed emotionally and socially for people who are narcissistic. I'm curious if you believe that to be a simple defense mechanism, in trying to regulate it differently or try to recover from that lack of being able to be themselves. So when that vulnerability, I guess I'm stuttering with the words, when that vulnerability is not something people can show, do they require that extra affirmation in order to manage that?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that the lack of vulnerability, I think that the shutdown then requires an excess of admiration or external validation from others, because you can't, you're not getting fed in the ways that we can get fed by being vulnerable, right? The emotional vulnerability allows us to sort of absorb it at a deeper level. So oftentimes I think narcissistic people will seek the superficial validation as a substitute for
That's
that internal.
Sterlin, by the way, thank you for understanding my awkward question, but you answered it exactly right. Exactly what I was thinking, and well spoken. That is what I'm thinking.
Well, because in order to have self-esteem, you need to be seen and loved. And if you can never be seen, you can never have that feeling of being truly loved.
Right, absolutely.
And so, that whole idea of the surface, like I'm starving for validation, but there's literally Teflon around me. And so it never gets to the parts that matter.
So it's interesting, Talia. I'm actually thinking about people in our life that we know, both of us, that tend to be narcissistic, and how that...
Are you going to start naming names?
I'm not going to name any names, but I'm thinking very clearly about what some of those people experience.
Yeah. Someone
very close to you. And their story.
My dog.
It's your dog. That's what I'm going to go with for the safety of this podcast. I really love that part. It actually really explains something so deeply. I also appreciate... I mean, it's interesting. I would say, Sterlin, too, you kind of sound like my professor in grad school. Like, we're not exactly sure. I also love that you said that it can be biological for some people, which implies not other people. So there's like this question mark, right? And so those of us who are clinicians doing this work, it might be, do what we can to understand the origins of this and help people understand it. However, and this is where this isn't even on here as a question, but the general philosophy that narcissists are resistant to treatment, that treatment does not help these people. With this information, it feels hopeful, like you'd be able to help people understand you did not receive that affirmation and validation, and you weren't able to be vulnerable, to be seen and regarded. And so that might be something that we work on, but that implies that people can do that work. So
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I do think that, as you all probably know, I do think narcissism is somewhat treatment resistant, only because they don't present a lot in clinical settings, right? Because they're like, I'm fine. I don't know what your problem is, but I'm fine.
And how dare you tell me that I'm not?
That's exactly right. Unless it's like court mandated, or their spouse is going to leave them, or their children won't speak to them.
But it still doesn't work, right?
Well, they have to really, really, really want whatever that leverage is. Like they really have to want to not lose their spouse or their job or go to jail or lose their children. Otherwise, no, they don't show up in therapy.
Yeah. I think I've found that a lot of times what you can work with narcissists is behaviors, because they don't want to be, for the most part, depending on what type of narcissist they don't want to be in conflict with people all the time either. I mean, they kind of want to smooth sailing. I just want to do what I want to do, So I think sometimes if you can help them learn different strategies for communicating or relating to other people, that can go a long way in helping their relationship dynamics. It's interesting, Doug, because what you were saying, when you're talking about helping them figure out the origins, and I kept sort of thinking about like holding the space for them and being empathetic towards the narcissistic person, because it's hard to do for a lot of people in their lives, but they're still people, right? And so I think definitely if you're working with them in any capacity, even though they can be antagonistic and difficult, like remembering that they're, I don't remember who it was, but somebody talked about like basically narcissist is like a deficit of self, right? And so if you can look at that empathetically and realize like, okay, this person just has a lot of armor on, and then it can go a long way. And I do think it helps them loosen their defenses, right? They kind of get their hackles up, right, with most people. But if you can be empathetic, then they can kind of let it down. Maybe a little slightly vulnerable. Yeah.
Slightly vulnerable, but and what I've found, Sterlin, in my work is that any challenge to this may not be effective. I recall one time one of my clients brought in their partner and significant other who was clearly a narcissist in to just kind of see like, what can we do with this? And what I did as an intervention was to say, so what if my client told you this? What if they were to say this to you? How would that feel? And the partner was like, that would feel really shitty. And I said, well, that's what you said to her. So I want you to like I really tried to do some insight oriented work, right? And I remember the person just stared at me for a while and they're like, well, that's shitty. I'm like, grab onto that and try to remember that.
Towards empathy.
It did not last.
No, like because my hunch is that saying you hurt someone's feelings is
a criticism.
But it's also like, I don't think they care. I think if you said, like, I don't think if they come into therapy and we're saying, we think that you're hurting people's feelings and don't you want other people to enjoy being around you?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that would be as powerful as, would you like to learn more about interpersonal effectiveness, which is sort of a DBT? It's like there has to be a point because they have to have a reason to want to connect.
Or what if we confronted it, just say, you're such an asshole.
I don't think they care. I don't think that they would care. I think that they would think you're sensitive.
Or they would gaslight me and say, I think you're an asshole because you said I'm an asshole.
That's right. Sterlin, what would happen? Play it out.
Well, so as the person who had, I mentioned my grandmother being narcissistic, and I a couple times, and I get the impulse for people because I recently taught narcissism in one of my undergrad classes, and they had a lot of questions, and they're like, well, what if we just tell them off and tell them that they're narcissists? I'm like, I mean, you can. They're not going to care. Yeah. And they're probably going to turn it around on you. And you're going to be frustrated, and they're going to be fine, right? And because I've done it, right? And I've done that with my grandmother. And so Talia, what you were saying, like they don't care. Like I have been like, you're awful and you're selfish, and she's like, I don't care. I don't care. And it just made me more mad. But what I do think works is because the empathy circuits aren't firing the same way. Sometimes you do have to show them like one for one, like if someone did this to you, what would you feel like? And then they're like, well, that would piss me off. And then it clicks like, oh, well, I just did that. Sometimes that works, depending on how much they care, right?
Which is exactly what that intervention was that I did in that office that day. And it worked for a moment. I mean, the person just stared at me for a moment and I'm like, is it resonating? Are you taking it in? The minute they left, they're like, yeah, that wasn't helpful. I'm like, oh.
And did they not come back?
Oh, they did not come back.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
There has to be a lot of joining at the beginning with someone who has narcissistic traits so that they feel like you see the best in them. And then it's like walking on eggshells to try to get in through all the side doors.
I still haven't been successful, though. Like, people don't stick with it because the challenge has to come at some point, right? Like, our job is to challenge toxic or dysfunctional patterns. And the minute that, even if you build that rapport up and you've fed them enough to make them feel comfortable, like at some point when you turn the table and like, do you wonder if that's helpful to you or helpful or hurtful to the other person? What?
But that's why the leverage is everything. They have to not want to lose the thing they're going to lose if they don't get it, even if it's just behavior change and not actual internal change.
Well, that's the question.
Yeah. No, I agree with both of you. I think that they are very, because they objectify everything and people, they do have to see a point, right? Like, if you do this, then you can get X, Y, Z, right? But it's difficult because as soon as you challenge them, many of them, that's when they get defensive, right? And they're like, it's a betrayal to them, right? Because you saw them, you were their friend, and you saw them, and you understood all that they're going through, and then all of a sudden you're not, right?
Shattered.
And they polarize. So they're challenging. I mean, it's
well, and then there's this other question, and when you work with someone, I have taught every person that I've supervised clinically, it's really helpful to have people understand what's going on for them. So trying to let somebody know this is your diagnosis, this is what the personality traits are that we're seeing is tricky.
Yeah, very tricky.
Because you at some point want to, tell that person very openly and honestly, like what it is that's going on. And I find myself always training people, like, go through the criteria, help them understand, is this what you experience? Is this something that happens for you? And so there's a part of this that I ultimately think that trickiness about like using that word can really trigger people, right? So we kind of referenced the gaslighting piece in kind of passing here. And, Sterlin, what we want to do too is kind of talk about some common things. Everyone is talking about narcissists. Everybody is talking about, that word. And, I'm kind of fascinated with how people make sense of it. But there are some common terms that are used pretty frequently when we talk about these people. One, of course, being gaslighting. And I've had people specifically say, what is gaslighting? I want to understand this. What is your definition? How would you describe that?
My definition would be a sort of conscious, and I say conscious because I think we all, this was a little bit of a debate in my undergrad class. So I think we all have different perceptions of what reality is, right? What's going on, and different accounts of different happenings in our lives. So it's quite normal for me to remember something slightly differently than for both of you to remember something, right? And I think oftentimes when that happens, there's sort of a meeting in the middle of like, okay, well, I don't remember it that way, or, oh, I remember this part, but not this part. I think gaslighting is a sort of conscious attempt to shift or change someone's reality or narrative to suit that person's agenda. And oftentimes, I think when we're talking about narcissism, gaslighting is a way for the narcissist to not ever be the bad guy or
to be held responsible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Or be responsible or be bad. And so the effect is of changing the other person's reality to fit the narcissist narrative of who they want to be and what they wanted that event or situation to reflect.
So you feel like it's conscious?
I do feel like a lot of times with narcissists, it's a conscious.
It's a really great question.
Yeah,
I'd say most of the time it's conscious. I would say sometimes it definitely happens unconsciously. And the reason I say conscious is because what happens, I've encountered this with narcissists myself, is when I have tried to say, okay, well, you remember that way, I remember it this way. And then they still try to enroll me in what their reality is and try to make that my reality. And then it becomes sort of a conscious, almost like a bullying kind of tactic. So I think that's why I use that term, conscious. But what about you all? What do you think?
No, it's really interesting. I was just going to say, like, if you approached that person at that point and you said, so are you aware that you're trying to change what I feel or what I think or what my experience was? I think they would say no. I believe that what I'm saying is factual, right? And so do I think that there's some subconscious piece to that? I do. Like, I think, and I agree with you, Sterlin. Like, one of the things I'm loving about this conversation, and I knew it was going to happen this way, is that nothing is black and white about this. Right. Like, there's this gray zone where there's these questions about, like, what is it? I love what you said. I think there can be both parts. I think people can be consciously aware that I'm debating somebody and I'm bullying somebody into believing what I believe. But I think the ultimate, like, reason for it or the underlying piece of it is more subconscious potentially.
Yes.
I think that's the hard piece. Like, I don't think people can understand the origins of why they're doing that bullying.
Yes.
Right?
Because there isn't as much self-awareness. I also feel like it must be subconscious because, I mean, I completely agree. But I had a little pre-meeting with somebody that we're going to have on the show. He's amazing. And he is a self-proclaimed he calls himself a managing severe narcissist. So he's going to be talking about his experience. But that's
going to be fun.
It's going to be amazing. But just in the few moments that I was having a conversation with him, he was talking about this experience of still, like after he's done all of this work, he said lies just pour out of his mouth and he catches it sometimes as they're coming out, but mostly it's like he'll say a thing and be like, well, that was a lie, and that was a lie, and that's a lie. And now he just calls himself out, but he can't yet get in front of the lie before it comes out of his face. It's amazing.
Well, I can't wait to interview this person, by the way, Sterlin. So it's going to be really fun. But the thing that I'm struck by in that is if I lie and I know I'm doing it, it's easy enough to say, I'm sorry, that was a lie. Like, and so the question is, why does he not do that? Like, what is it that propels him to keep doing this and digging a hole deeper? I cannot wait.
Well, no, I think he's saying it out loud now, but it just,
like he's saying,
oh, that was a lie. But I think
like I can do your makeup. No, that's a lie.
Doug keeps on wanting to do my makeup.
I really want to.
And I told him that if I'm completely incapacitated,
like in a coffin,
I'll let him.
That'll be good. All right.
Anyway,
I am coming. Yeah.
In the grave, you can do.
In the grave, unless I can still use these 3 fingers. But
I feel insulted by my ability.
You could do my hair.
Can I do your hair and makeup and pick your wardrobe?
Yes.
I do pick your wardrobe.
You mean for my gravestone photo?
No, I kind of want to do it every day. So when we live together. In a condo.
Just do my makeup.
I'm going to do your makeup and hair every day.
I can't. I'll let you do it once, and then I'll.
That doesn't feel right.
I'll rate you 1 to 10.
I'm gonna play a narcissist with you.
Oh my!
I'm kidding.
He's gonna gaslight me.
Let's role play what narcissism looks like right now.
Another term that I feel like everybody.
Are you changing the topic? You don't want to play narcissist, Doug? Keep going.
Actually,
I'm sorry, keep going.
I would love to know more about this.
Sterlin's like, let's go.
I'm going to sit back and
do it.
Do you want to pretend to be
I'd like you to give me a lot of affirmation about my ability to do your makeup.
I think you're going to be really good at it.
Thank you.
Now, how many epidermal layers did it sink in?
There's that fuel. There's that narcissistic fuel he needed.
Thank you. Thank you, Sterlin, for observing that.
No, but I need to know how many.
Not much. I need a lot more.
Epidermal layers?
Okay.
Because if it got
I feel
really
like you're
deep
gaslighting me
soul,
now, and you're trying.
Do you have a soul?
Oh.
I'm going to do some more narcissistic.
That feels hurtful.
Oh, I love you, and you'd be great at doing makeup. But I still want to know about love bombing.
Sterlin, I win. I won that one. Okay. Love bombing. God, I love it.
I know. Well, because I feel like, is that a very subjective term? Is it like I wrote you a song or I got you a bouquet of 12 long stem roses? Or is it like...
Or like when you just told me that you loved me?
I was coerced.
That was sincere, though.
It was. Just in that moment. I do.
Oh, I love you too.
Is this your broken shoulder?
Nope, this one is. You want to feel it?
It's very bumpy.
Yep.
It's very lumpy and bumpy.
Yep.
So will you tell us what you think about the continuum of love bombing?
Of love bombing. This one's trickier because I think some things that are sort of normal, like, people that, believe in love at first sight or very romantic or amorous, right? I think some of that stuff has gotten lumped in with love bombing, and it gets a little fuzzy. I think there's definitely a continuum. I think there's, in that romantic phase of any relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship or a job, right? There's the honeymoon phase. And I think that we all can do, say long range things that maybe won't come to fruition. And, we're going to be together forever, that kind of thing, especially when we're younger. I think that kind of stuff is normal. I think love bombing. So I have a good example. I have a friend who started dating this man, and he was, very charming, and he was very wealthy. And on their first date, he wanted to fly her to, I believe it was Morocco, for their first date. And she was like, "It's just so romantic." And I was like, "Yeah, okay."
Red flag. Red
It's
flag.
also really extreme. Yep.
Right. It was a little extreme. And then it was this whole fairy tale, right? They flew private and they stayed in a 5-star hotel, and it was just nothing but the best. And this is literally their first date. And he's saying, he's promising things, and she's completely sort of out of her mind with this, sort of blinded by this fantasy, right, that he's weaving. And so they ended up dating for a couple of months. And what happened is because the initial phases of the relationship were so intense and so extreme, that when he started to cut that kind of behavior off, right, he wasn't giving her these extravagant gifts, or he didn't call her for 3 or 4 days, what it activated is that sort of addiction center in the brain, right, where it's like, wait a minute, like, what happened? Like, where's my hit, right? And so she thought she was doing something wrong. And then they were in the dance, right? The whole narcissistic, toxic relationship thing. That to me was a good example of love bombing. I mean, extreme, but still love bombing. And so that would be, I think it is on a continuum. I like that you said that, Talia, because that's the way I think of it.
Yeah, I do love the word continuum too, but it kind of makes me think a little bit. And when I think about love bombing, the whole point is that the love comes in a way that's extreme and intense. And I'm going to say, as a result of that, not genuine, not authentic, not kind of a normal progression of an organic connection with somebody and development to a relationship. I remember we had a mailbag from someone where she was like, "Oh my God, he took his guitar out and sent me a song. It's too much." Right. It was a love song. Like, he's like, way over the top. And I'm thinking some people would love that.
Yes, that's so
like,
romantic.
that's really simple. Like,
but that's the continuum.
That is. And it's different for everybody as to how you experience it. Like, I think some people would feel that overwhelm.
Right.
And I think, please fly me to Morocco.
I know. I like
for anybody listening,
love
please.
bombing.
And then I'll call you, Sterlin, so you can keep me mindful of how really irrational that is. And it's
grounded.
And it's not going to thank you.
Right.
I will call you for groundedness, Sterlin.
Well, I mean, what you brought up that I think is really important too is there is this like the fantasy, the fairy tale.
Yep.
And just like this idea of being swept off your feet, love at first sight. And it is this sort of template that I think many of us have in our head. So when we think about falling in love, it does feel like that. But every honeymoon phase does end up coming to an end, and then it gives way to who you are when you're not waking up 2 hours early every day to drive across town to get that cup of coffee and drive someone to the airport before you get kind of comfortable, right? And then that's your relationship.
I have so much to say about that. Like, there's a part of me that thinks too, like the right connection or and I'm going to say right, like if there's someone that's in that range of being the right person for you, I don't think the organic piece gets lost in it. Mm-hmm. And I think, in the case of your friend though, again, it was like really huge. It was really over the top. It was a gesture that felt over the top, but it could have turned out okay too. But that's why you have to keep, I always tell people, you have to keep mindful. Like, how do you feel in this relationship? Do you feel like it's progressing in this right way? Is the communication effective and is it adaptive? And, that's where I think this love bombing can turn into something really awful. So the next term is breadcrumbing.
Mm-hmm. Which I've never heard.
Do you remember Hansel and Gretel?
Yes, and then don't they get like eaten?
So I think this is related. So please, I knew I'd get a nod from you, Sterlin. Please tell me, what do you think? What do you think of that term?
Yes. Yes, breadcrumbing so it's the giving you a little bit, right? So it's if I'm even kind of tying this into the love bombing thing. So say you love bomb at the beginning. This actually, my friend got breadcrumbs, right? So then he went cold, and then he would do a little bit here and there, right? He would send flowers or whatever when she'd be like about to break up with him, or she'd be just so angry that she couldn't handle it. Then he'd give her a little bit, right? And then it would get her back in the dynamic, right? And then it would be okay. And then she'd get mad, he'd go cold, and then he'd buy her watch or whatever. And so there were these little, it keeps you engaged in the dynamic. And I'm even thinking of, my best friend worked for a narcissist for many years. And she would hardly ever praise her, but then occasionally she'd say, well, that was good. You did a good job with that. And because you never get it, the dopamine centers in your brain are like, praise, right? They liked it. And so that's how I think of breadcrumbing. It's these just little bit to keep you engaged in the dynamic so that you don't leave, but it's not enough, right? But we're subsisting on breadcrumbs, basically, from the narcissist who's doling it out.
Yep.
It reminds me of those rats in those horrible experiments that just press that, like, I don't know, that pleasure sensor.
You just get a little bit.
And they starve to death.
Yes.
So you guys, if you're dating this person, you're going to starve
and you're starving
to death by waiting for those breadcrumbs.
Yep.
Go get a burger. That's all I have to say.
Don't do the breadcrumb anymore. Get the whole get the whole
piece
fucking
of bread.
sub. Get the whole big foot long. Don't get the half.
No.
Go to Subway and get the whole foot long.
Flick the crumbs right back in their face.
Yes.
That's a whole nother category.
Breadcrumb flicking.
When you want to give it back.
Okay, well, what about this one that I've heard of even less? I've literally have no idea what this is.
I don't either.
The Darvo method.
Yes. So Darvo is, and I always have to look up the, it basically, it's where it's deny, attack, and reverse victim offender. So basically what happens is...
Wait, slow that down, Sterlin. Would you say that one more time? My brain needs it again.
Deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. So what happens is the narcissist, so say, for example, you accuse the narcissist of doing something selfish. And then they deny that it was selfish. And then they attack you for calling them selfish. How selfish of you to call me selfish. How mean of you. I can't believe you would say that to me after all the things I've done. And then they've become the victim and you've become the offender. So that's the reverse victim offender.
Oh,
my
God.
It's a very common method that they use. That's why you don't call them narcissists to their face, because then you're going to end up being called a narcissist and you're going to feel like a terrible person, and then you're going to leave and go, what happened?
It's almost turning the tables. I might call it turning the tables.
Yes.
Turning the tables.
It's the signature move. I didn't know that's what it was called.
I didn't either. I can't believe you said...
It's a little clunky. It's a little clunky.
It's a little clunky, and that's why I'm like, I think I need an easier phrase. Like, it's just really turning the tables on somebody, and when when you appear to be a victim, there's that thumbs up again on our screen.
No, it's so funny when
it's really an interesting thing. I love how easily that came up for you, and I did not know it was an acronym. So I'm very excited about that. And it's really just kind of reversing, like when you did something that harms somebody, and then you reverse it and say that they're harming you for, accusing them or calling them on the carpet, or, letting them know that their behavior affected you somehow. I got to tell you, the interesting thing, and this is what I want to say about this too, to our viewers, is that if you end up doing that in conversations with your significant other or your friends or your family members, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a narcissist. It might mean that you're just kind of feeling defensive, because it also, I think, really indicates how people get defensive about some things. Like, I didn't do that, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a narcissist if you end up feeling victimized by someone being affected by what you did.
And sometimes it's like levels of emotional maturity, of just being able to sit in the possibility that you did something that wasn't your best move.
Yes, right.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And all of these sort of things we talk about in the narcissist toolbox, like we can all do them one-off or occasionally. I think when we're looking at narcissists, we're looking at a pattern of behavior where they use these things frequently, and that's the set of tools they use all the time, right?
Which, Sterlin, kind of brings us to our next question for you about when we determine this is a diagnosis and it's something that meets the diagnostic criteria for personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, or if it's really just something that is a part of someone's dynamic and that, you know, again,
like
determining.
Traits of.
Yeah, absolutely. Where somebody has traits of versus. Because, you know, and I remember in grad school, I always tell this funny story. I remember we were going through the diagnostic manual as part of the class, and we got to the personality disorders, and I finally looked up at the group and I said, does everybody feel like you're all of these? Because we all, and I remember like taking a big risk, like I'm going to be ostracized if everybody else is like, no, we don't have any of these OCPDs or.
Well, this makes me a little worried about myself right now because what does it mean about me that I went through the Access 2 stuff and I was like, oh, this sounds like everyone but me.
It means narcissist. Sterlin, what do we need to do with her now?
Sterlin diagnosed
goes, oh no! It says a lot,
It's bad.
Talia, and we're going to save
bad.
that for another episode.
Right. That might be a whole other thing to unpack. No, I did the same thing, Doug. When I went through I had that thing when I went through grad school and counseling, and I thought I had everything. Every week I was like, well, this is me.
I am NOS, not otherwise specified.
You're NOS. Right. I love it.
So as far as the question of when does it cross over into a clinical diagnosis, so I'm a little bit of the camp that I kind of want NPD to be taken out of the DSM because I think that because for me, I think when you diagnose, right, it has to be causing some kind of impairment for the person. I think for most narcissists, unless they're court ordered or they're, threat divorce or they're getting their kids taken away, that's obvious impairment. But I also think it's a lot more prevalent than most of us. I mean, I think the statistics are like 1%. I would say closer to 10 to 15% of people have some degree of narcissistic traits. Because it's so prevalent, I prefer to think of it as like an overlay, right? A personality overlay. And we talked about the Enneagram types before. So I think, there's personality types, and then you can have this narcissistic overlay. I think it exists along a continuum, right? Where when you get into the extreme levels, that would be probably more where we would look at clinical diagnosis, right? Where they're so narcissistic, they can't function in the world. There's probably other things going on that are exacerbating that. I don't think that's the majority of people that struggle with narcissism, or they don't struggle. We struggle with narcissism.
That's right.
Narcissism. And so I prefer to think of it as like an antagonistic personality style rather than a diagnosis. And the reason I think it should be evaluated is in terms of taking it out is because people are so uncomfortable using the term sometimes. A lot of people are like, I'm not qualified to say that. I don't know if, and I'm like, is it a cat? Like, does it have ears and fur?
Looks like a cat. Sounds like a cat.
Let's call a thing, right? So, and people are so uncomfortable. Even, I have family members who are like, I don't want to say that. I'm like, but is that what it is?
That's right.
Because they think they're not qualified to call them a narcissist because they're not clinicians. So I'm a little bit of that camp. I could argue it both ways, but I would say if it's causing impairment, they're getting their kids taken away, or they,
or they continuously have bad relationships that can't succeed because there's a need for reciprocity and mutuality in any relationship.
Yes.
So,
right.
Yeah, Sterlin.
Then we could look at that.
Sterlin, it's a fascinating conversation about whether or not it should be taken out. I think, my vote might be to keep it in. And part of it is I do think terms like depression, mania are overused in our culture. I think people use these terms so quickly. Like, I'm feeling so manic. I've heard from so many people. I'm like, are you really? Yeah. Because that almost minimizes the incredibly discomfortable part of being manic for people who experience bipolar at that severity. So I don't love how quickly we throw out terms. I would rather people probably leave it to us. I'm probably on that side of things, like leave it to the professionals to do the diagnostic part, because it's a big label. And I think, again, since the 2016 election, I really think people are throwing it around so quickly and so easily. And if they don't like somebody's behavior, going back to your comment about like it's an averse type of personality or interaction, I like it too.
Antagonistic.
But all of us could be that. So I don't think all of us are narcissistic, but I think it's being overly used at this point.
I mean,
when you did not think any of the personality traits applied
to you. It was everybody else.
Even I know.
I'm perfect, whereas others have issues.
Oh, no, please feel free to mailbag us about that, viewers.
I really love the idea of it being a personality style, and I never thought about the impairment piece because it's causing more external damage than maybe internal. But the way that I think about personality disorders versus traits of is, well, the whole characteristics all together, like the whole package, but also there's like a self-awareness piece of someone who is unable to accurately see themselves. Yeah. So it's the person, and this is great holiday timing because everybody's having dinners with a lot of people.
Narcissists.
And other things, but it's like the person in the room that everybody walks out of the room and goes, my God.
That was a lot.
Ooh, that was a lot. Or like, oh, that person has a personality disorder of some sort. And if you don't hear anyone saying that at your dinners, it might be you.
I'll tell you honestly, I always tell people, like, if you're struggling with someone, if somebody, and I remember when I was doing my training, and I might have mentioned this at the introduction part of our episode today, but I remember when I was training with my supervisor, who was really just very effective in helping me understand, and I was able to be vulnerable and trust him. Like, I could tell him if I was attracted to a client and I was struggling with that, or if I was really struggling with kind of seeing what a diagnostic piece might be. The part that was so amazing is I found myself wanting to punch a narcissist. Like, I just found myself really agitated and wanting to just beat the shit out of him. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not helpful. And my supervisor helped me understand, like, listen to yourself. Mm-hmm. This is what other people will experience with this person as well. I'm an instrument. Yeah. Like, I use that, that counter-transferential experience and make sure that you understand that this is what people in their life are experiencing. Yes. Please.
Yeah, no, I was thinking as you were talking, both of you were talking, so as I'm writing my second book, and I had an experience at a Starbucks where there were these teenagers ordering food and coffee, and they were talking about that they were in some, I don't know, Discord group or, whatever, kids do things. And they were in something, and they were talking about how everybody else in the school didn't like them because they were self-aware narcissists. And they were saying, these are like 16 and 17-year-old kids, right? And they're like, they're just jealous because, we're better than them and we are more confident and we're not bogged down by our empathy. And they were like, it's also ableist because we are narcissistic, and that's it's like being autistic. And I was like, oh no.
What did you do? That's what I want to know.
Oh, I just took notes because I'm writing about it myself. So then later I went on and I explored on the sort of weird dark side of this self-aware narcissistic community, where there's a big thing now where they're, because there's a DSM diagnosis for them, they're like, it's discrimination, right? It's ableist to talk about narcissism in the way that we're talking about it now. And and so I was like, oh, that's scary.
That is really scary.
That's kind of what kind of tipped me to like, let's take it out.
But then would you say that a self-aware narcissist speaking the way you overheard them speak, isn't that more of a sociopath, like wanting to do harm?
I don't know. I feel like it's, you're mentioning an age group that I think of as emotionally immature, right? So I'm not sure what that is. I think it could be, I'm not big on the word phases, but there could be a phase that these kids are going through.
There could be, yes.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I was like, I took into account the age, but the fact that they even latched onto that as a thing, and they have this group where they all call themselves narcissists, I was like, that's disturbing to me. But more disturbing was the ableist thing.
Oh my God,
and
it's
I'm
crazy.
kind of trying to attack that in my book.
Which, by the way, that's never going to stick, because as anybody knows, if there was any sort of like discriminatory like process approached by them or formally filed somewhere as a disability or something, like, you can't discriminate against me because I'm a narcissistically personality disordered person.
I mean,
I would say, no, you're going to need a clinician to actually verify that. And someone coming in and saying, I'm a narcissist and this is why, is not going to meet the criteria for a narcissist.
But do you know what's kind of interesting to think about?
Tell me what it is.
I'm going to tell you.
Are you going to tell me?
I'm going to tell you guys what's so interesting.
That you don't think you have any personality traits that are troublesome? You
no,
don't, by the way.
Only glorious. I do. I do
You
have
do not.
quite a few.
Oh,
I
no,
know.
you do not.
And I know them. No.
Let me do your makeup.
Here's what's interesting is that there are some narcissistic traits that are interwoven in some like autism spectrum disorders. That is really interesting. And I wonder if it brings it back to what you said, Sterlin, about the empathy circuitry. And I've never thought about it like that, but is that, and you made it sound like that's something that can be developed, that it's lesser in some folks, but what do you think about that piece of the empathy and how do we boost our empathy?
So I'm glad you mentioned the autistic sort of correlation. I talk about that in the book. There's a researcher named Simon Baron-Cohen, who was actually Sacha Baron Cohen's cousin or something.
No way.
But anyway, he researches autism and empathy, and he has a book called something about evil. I'll think of it as I'm talking. But anyway, I read it. And he's talking about people with what he calls zero-sum empathy, like zero, nothing, no empathy, right? And I disagree somewhat with his research, and then he's saying, autistic people don't have empathy, and I don't believe that to be true. I think their circuitry is different, the way that they access empathy. Like, for example, I have actually quite a few autistic friends. And a lot of them, for example, one of them says, well, I have to think about people as animals. If I think about them as like a cute animal, then it allows me to empathize with them more. Or one of my friends thinks about them as like stuffed animals. And then they're cuter, it's softer, it's less. So I think about someone like Temple Grandin, who, maybe a lot of people didn't think she had a lot of interpersonal empathy, but she had a lot of empathy for the cows that she was helping to not feel pain and terror when they were being slaughtered, right? So I think that the way that many of them access empathy is just different, which is hence neurodivergent, right? As opposed to narcissism, where I do think sometimes there's a conscious choice not to empathize. Like, it's like, I refuse to use those muscles. But then when they go through, really human things, like we all go, like grief, for example, sometimes you can see kind of an opening for them. They'll be more feelingful. They'll be more vulnerable, some of them. And so I think for a lot of narcissists, because it's that armor, there's this, because they don't want to be vulnerable, empathy is vulnerable, right? It feels vulnerable to empathize with other people. So because they're closed off to vulnerability, they're often closed off to the ability or the desire to want to develop their empathy. Whereas I think a lot of autistic people, as far as the ones that I've encountered, like want to know, like, what is it everyone's feeling? Like, how do I do that? Like, how do I get there? And you can sometimes work with them to develop how they access their empathy.
That's fascinating.
It is fascinating. Sterlin, we have had the most amazing guests on our podcast, and yet every once in a while there are people who I just want to talk for hours and hours and hours, and that would be you. I would love to continue this dialogue. I would, of course, love to talk about other topics. I love how you talk. You have a deep compassion about mental health. You have a very intelligent way of looking at diagnostic pieces. I love that your word that you use a lot is sometimes or not always, because I really think that people get into such stuck places about diagnostic, but also treatment strategies. And I love your ability to stay in that gray zone and think about things in a very mindful and thoughtful and compassionate way. This has been
thank you.
really what I was craving
Yes.
from this dialogue when Talia let me know that you were going to be our guest. It was really an enriching conversation. I am delighted to have had it. And I hope our viewers feel the same
thank
way.
you.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you for having me.
Yeah, it's just a pleasure.
It's been a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
It has been so much fun. And
Yep.
I think you're so fantastic. And for our guests that are interested in the Enneagram,
Yep.
Sterlin and I dive so deep into narcissism in the Enneagram.
Yeah.
And he has 27 different types of narcissism and how it plays out in the different Enneagram types. So we're going to put that out there as a bonus episode that you guys are going to be obsessed with.
I believe so too. It was a really, really great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sterlin, tell us a little bit about how our listeners can find you, where they might find more information from you.
So I have my author website, which is just sterlinmosley.com. And then I also have an Enneagram consulting and coaching business called Empathy Architects. And I do that with my best friend. And we've been studying the Enneagram for 20 years. And we have a podcast called Do You Know You?
I love that name.
Talk about the Enneagram and all that stuff. And then also on Instagram, we post a lot on there. And so that's at Empathy Architects on social media. One of the better podcasts, I'd have to say, that I've done. So you guys are a lot of fun. So I love it.
Yay!